All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining for today's webinar with Positive Coaching Alliance and Deloitte. We are going to be having a great conversation on all things team leadership and specifically around captains and how to develop quality leaders in a variety of ways. Thank you so much for joining us on a Friday afternoon where I know there's quite a few sporting events happening right now. And so we're looking forward to an awesome conversation. A few housekeeping items before I turn it over to our moderator. This webinar is being recorded, and so we will be sharing that out with all of the registrants and attendees so that we can share this more widely with our networks. If you have any questions that pop up that you would like to ask any of the panelists, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom for the webinar. Positive Coaching Alliance is super honored to have had Deloitte's and specifically Dan Helfrich's support over the last many years, and very excited to introduce the chairman and CEO of Deloitte Consulting and also a father of four very avid sports children, Dan Helfrich. So Dan, if you can turn on your camera and I'll turn it over to you. So looking forward to this conversation.
Thanks, Casey. Hello, PCA Nation. This should be a really fun conversation. And I'm excited because it's three people I look up to a ton and that I think will bring different lenses into the always, I think, fantastic conversation about the translation of leadership lessons from players, from coaches, from parents into both the sporting world and society and the business world beyond. So I'll do quick bios and then we'll get started with a fun conversation. First, joining us, one of my idols as a soccer player, and a recent author, Christine Lilly. Christine, one of the leading scorers in the history of the U.S. women's national soccer team. She's a co-founder of Team First Soccer Academy, and she's a recent author, the most recent author that we'll have today. She wrote Powerhouse, which is a cool book that talks about taking lessons from the field and putting them into place in business and other places. So Christine, welcome.
Thank you, Dan. Great to be here with you.
All right, next we got Sam Walker. Sam wrote one of the books that's had the most profound impact on me, Captain Class. Sam was a longtime reporter for the Wall Street Journal. And now most of Sam's time is spent as a consultant on leadership development for teams around the world, in particular professional sports teams. And I know, Sam, you're itching to have this conversation.
Itching is a good word.
Itching. And then finally, Jesse Washington. Jesse is a journalist for ESPN Andscape, which is the expanded and rebranded Undefeated. And Jesse came into my life as the acclaimed author with Coach John Thompson of Georgetown of I Came as a Shadow, which really hits at what Jesse is known for, which is the intersection of race, sports, and culture. And Jesse is also a sports parent of a couple college basketball players and an athlete in high school. So Jesse has a bunch of vantage points. So Jesse, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And Jesse, I mean, during March Madness in particular, joining us while games are going on, we appreciate. And we won't talk about the games because we know some of you will be watching this on video. So Jesse, let's start with you. You got what I have to imagine was an incredible life experience of spending time with Coach Thompson in the years before his passing, as you were writing the book. And one of the things you talk about in the book is Coach Thompson hearing a lesson from Dean Smith, the famous North Carolina coach, about how much of coaching effectiveness has nothing to do with basketball at all. I think Dean Smith attributed 70% to that. And so Coach Thompson's famous for focus on culture, for little things like helping people clean up after practice, making sure you thank the managers and the trainers, et cetera. I'm curious, as you spent time with Coach Thompson and reflected on his career, what'd you learn about the non-X's and O's parts of leadership as a coach that matter?
It was so refreshing and illuminating to hear him say these things because it touched on something that you sort of feel like, but then we get consumed with winning. You know, we're consumed with winning. And I've coached youth sports, and it's hard not to be consumed with winning for fourth graders, when that is so far from the most important thing that you're supposed to be doing out there. And the same really applies to college sports at the highest level where John Thompson was at. He was very transparent and upfront about him wrestling with those desires to do the right thing and also to win, because he knew that his success and his livelihood and him being listened to depended on him winning, but he also knew that he could do things to the detriment of his students because of it. So for him to be so honest about his selfish desires to win and how he balanced that, he basically said, I had to protect myself from my own worst instincts. And so that's really what came across so strongly in this book. And as he describes how he dealt with those challenges within himself, I think it really provides a model for all of us who are involved with young people in sports and outside of sports, as to make sure that we're doing the best things for them.
Boy, Jesse, if more players and coaches had Coach Thompson's voice saying, how do I protect myself from my worst instincts? And parents, we'd have a lot more civil environment for sports at the youth level for sure.
Don't forget the parents.
yeah, the parents, and we'll certainly spend time talking about parents during our time together today. So, Christine, one of the things that you talk about in the book that I love, because it's something I think a ton about as a leader in business, is sort of the concept of servant leadership. And you talk about the best players, the most impactful leaders help get done what needs to get done. And so I'm curious, as you think about the most impactful leaders, how did they show up every day to live that servant leadership, let's get done what needs to get done mentality?
Yes. I mean, I've been so fortunate to have been on the national team for 23 years, but to have been at a time where I played with Julie Foudy and Carla Overbeck. And those were the two leaders during the I would say from 95 to 2000. And in that period, we won the Olympics in 96, and then we won the World Cup in 99. And to have those two leaders, which were very different. Julie was more vocal, more passionate, more just like always 100 miles an hour. Carla was the even keel. When Jules was going crazy, she'd look at Carla would look at Julie and go, Jules, what are you doing? She's like, okay. So you had the balance, and that was incredible. But then you had these same players that you would see Carla picking up the cones when, practice was over. So when you saw that, and you're like, oh my God, our leader is doing that. Why am I not doing that? So immediately you kind of corrected yourself. And then what they did as well is they led by example. They led by what they did, playing, by saying, but then also they built trust and respect in us with them. So whatever they were doing, I was making sure me, Mia, Michelle, Akers, Brandy, whatever Jules and Carla were saying, we were reiterating to the rest of the team. And that kind of contagious leadership was so powerful for our group. And we didn't have many loose ends. You always have a couple players that want to try to do things on their own way, but we didn't have too many because everyone kind of bought into what we were trying to do. And I'd have to say, to set that foundation and that groundwork of Carla and Julie and the national team at that time, that started from Anson Dorrance, who was the first U.S. coach in 91, the World Cup. And now he's still current head coach at the University of North Carolina. He kind of set that foundation and that chemistry and culture early on, playing for each other, working for each other, caring about each other. And all these elements kind of came into place. And none of us were bigger than the sum of us. And that was really something to be a part of and to just witness the greatness in leadership. And I'll share one story. We had Michelle Akers. I'm not sure if some of you are familiar with Michelle Akers. She arguably is probably the best player in the world. Totally. And she was 5'10", about 6 feet with her hair, a dominant player. And we have this picture of her. We were in the 95 World Cup in Sweden. And this is back in the day. We didn't have any managers. I think we had one equipment guy. So we're carrying bags. And there's a picture I have of Michelle. She's standing there. We're getting off a train. And suddenly someone was like, oh, everyone get bags. And Michelle grabbed one. And then we all started to throw our bags on top of her. So she had like 6 bags hanging from her, just standing there. And it kind of it made us laugh, but it's also what our team was about. the best players were doing just as much as the players that didn't get much playing time off the field, and really had a great, it was a great atmosphere, but all due to our leadership and the culture that this team had.
Love it. So Sam, Christine's such a good straight person for conversations you and I have had a bunch over the last couple of years. And actually, if you think about, Jesse just talked about culture being set by coach. Christine talked a little bit about coach and a lot about captain and leadership. You actually, you went about trying to research in formal ways the most important attributes of the most successful dynasties, those that have consistent performance over time. You might have studied Christine's women's national team along the way.
Absolutely, yes.
And so curious, we'll have, again, players, parents, coaches listen to this. What did your research tell you? And as you've continued looking into sports leadership development, the role of the captain versus the role of the coach in shaping culture?
It was fascinating to me because, like a lot of people, when I started this project, I said, I want to figure out what I think the best teams in sports history are, and then what do they have in common? I thought talent, tactics, coaching. Coaching was really the thing I thought it would be. I thought that's where culture comes from. That's where sustained success comes from. And again, there are a million ways to win and be good. What I was studying were teams that had sustained a culture of excellence for a long time, had just won beyond the length of any other team. Because I thought that was the best way to look at culture. So the big shock to me was, at first it seemed like coaches didn't matter that much because, there were teams that had changed coaches, right? Most of the coaches of these great dynasties, had very little coaching experience or no coaching experience before they took over. Some of them had mediocre records. They weren't, only one of them was really considered a great coach before that run of dominance began. So I was very confused by this. And I saw the pattern with captains and how important they were and how closely their time at the team was tied to the winning streak. But what I realized after really looking at it was, the number one thing that I tell coaches, no matter what, managers, no matter what kind of team you run, is that the greatest teams, the greatest dynasties had a partnership. I mean, it was a real partnership. It was not a top-down, I'm your boss, you work for me, you're going to do what I say. It was really a partnership, almost like an old married couple in some ways. I mean, there's a lot of back and forth. There's an open relationship. They'll fight, they'll bicker, they'll argue, they'll contradict each other. But at the end of the day, there's enough respect there and enough understanding that they're going to come to the right solution. They're going to compromise, and there's not going to be any hard feelings. You see this over and over again. Tim Duncan and Greg Popovich are my favorite example. I mean, they would get so mad at each other that Tim Duncan would go sit on the scorer's table. It's like, I'm not going to sit anywhere near Pop, right? But they would make up and they would talk it through and they would move forward together. So that was fascinating. The great coaches of great dynasties had a partnership with that captain. And the culture of that team was partly due to how they interacted, what leadership skills they had, how well they complemented each other and also mirrored each other. But everything comes from that partnership. The culture, everything around the team and its success, is really founded on this germ of the coach and the leader of the players and those people and how well they work together.
Sam, did you find anything, and again, as you're doing research and as you put it in practice, about how important the talent level on the field or the court of the captain or the team leaders were in their effectiveness? You hear theories of it better be the quarterback, it better be the leading scoring striker, it better be the 25-point a game scorer. What'd you find?
That was one of the most shocking things was that most of these great captains, the elite captains, some of them were superstars, but the vast majority were not. They were like Carla Overbeck, who was, probably not the best athlete on the team, right? Not the star, not Mia Hamm, not Julie Foudy, not Christine Lilly, not the person who had the most talent. But, they were relentless. They were always on the field. They never came off. They had a talent level that could keep them involved. But, oftentimes they were probably the worst just athlete in raw terms on the team. And they always did, these servant jobs. I mean, most of them were defensive players. They were people who, you wouldn't see them or notice them unless you were a real, geek and you really understood strategy. You wouldn't see them. They didn't do dramatic things. They kind of led from the back. And that was really surprising. The biggest mistake I think coaches make, and the first thing I say is, you're probably picking the wrong captain, because if you're walking into the room and saying, all right, who's the best player? Who looks like a captain? Who acts like a captain? Who, and that's how we make a lot of these decisions. But really the way to do it, when I studied it closely, is that so much of leadership is what goes on in the shadows, what goes on behind the scenes, the things you don't see. So the better approach is to say, walk into your team, take a good look at them and say, who's the last person anyone would think is the captain of this team? And it's probably not that exact person, but you're probably closer to the right answer if you go in that direction than if you go the other way, because it's really about just doing selfless things, being hyper vigilant, doing a lot of work behind the scenes and not expecting any credit.
Love it. So Jesse and Christine, you both, in slightly different ways in your books, talk about intentionality of mentoring and relationships within players. Christine, you talk about green and gray players, which I'll ask you to tell the group about. Jesse, you talk in I Came as a Shadow, Coach Thompson, about matching of, senior folks like Ed Spriggs, who I got to know when I was at Georgetown as an athlete and he was on staff, and a freshman like Patrick Ewing. What'd you learn about the intentionality of mentoring and connecting of, in that case, the more experienced player with the newer player?
I found that fascinating. I'm glad that you asked, because Coach Thompson had something that's so essential for coaches, which is emotional intelligence. He understood people and human nature and how they interact. And it's such a valuable skill and it's overlooked. And he was considered just to be a bully or something like that. So, he remarked that Ed Spriggs welcomed Patrick Ewing knowing he was going to take all his playing time. Knowing that the better Patrick got and the more he helped Patrick, the less he would play, which takes a special kind of person on the team. Another thing that Coach Thompson did was he recruited different guys for purposes. He saw the big picture of the team from an emotional and an educational perspective, when a lot of people would just look at the basketball abilities of the player. So right when he got to Georgetown, he knew he was going to be bringing in a lot of athletes to an unfamiliar environment and an unforgiving academic environment. So he brought a guy with him from high school named Aaron Long. And Aaron wasn't the best player, but he was a great student. And he said he knew that studious quality that Aaron Long had would rub off on the rest of the team, or at least some of them. He said it was like seeding the clouds to make it rain. And he said that the program it didn't show in the statistics, but the program was much more successful because a guy like Aaron Long was there. So, to me, that just showed a tremendous ability to see the bigger picture and to help people do better by the character of the individuals that you have. Now, for youth coaches out there, you don't get to recruit your team. You got to take what comes to you. So I think that in that respect, in order to do the type of things that Coach Thompson did, you can celebrate and elevate these qualities that are sometimes overlooked. And you can make those kids see that those qualities are valued, and that will encourage them to exhibit more of it, and will encourage other kids to respect and value these intangibles. You may not be the fastest or the biggest or the strongest, but you bring something else to the table that's important for our success. That's what Coach Thompson did, and I think that that's what more coaches would really be mindful to do.
I love it, Jesse. And I do think it applies to, youth coaches. Think about an AAU team or a travel soccer team. They're having tryouts. The team's been together for 2 years. 4 great players from outside the club come in. What, Coach Thompson would have said a measure of success is that the existing players would celebrate new teammates, even if they would eventually take playing time from them. And spending a lot of time in the youth sports landscape, I don't think there's a lot of team cultures that hit that mark today. And I think it's a really interesting paradigm for coaches and for parents to think about as a sign of culture. Christine, I referenced green and the gray. I wonder you'd share that concept with people and then maybe reflect on what Jesse just shared.
Yes, I mean, Well, we talk about green and gray. It's basically a rookie and a veteran. You know, you're a veteran player that you've been around for a while, and then you got these young green players coming in that are rookies. And I think that the interesting thing about the effects that the green can have on the gray is basically when you're a rookie, you don't really have fear. You have really nothing to lose. You haven't been there. Your ultimate job is to try to make the team you're on and find your niche. And ultimately you're like kind of, ignorant is not the right word, but you're kind of like, oh, okay, whatever happens, happens. And so that brings the kind of refreshment and like less anxiety, less stress in some sense. The veteran players have been around a while. They're like, oh, these green players come in. Oh my gosh, what are they gonna, what do I have to do to keep my spot also, but also what do I have to do to show them the ropes without handing them, a position. And what's really interesting, when I was young on the team, I was 16 when I made the national team, and Mia was 15 and Julie Fati was 16. The three of us and Joy Fawcett made the team. We were real young green rookie players. And Anson had cut some older players, which at this time was like 22, 23 years old, to bring us on. It wasn't very popular. People weren't very happy about that. But when we came in, when we went on our first trip to China, he partnered up with the older player. So I had a bigger sister. Each of us had big sisters, and mine was Karen Jennings-Gabbero, who's now the current Naval Academy coach. She's been there for over 30 years. And it was one of the smartest things he did, not to help us smoothly transition into it, but to show us what it takes. And I remember Karen be like so nice to me. When we stepped on that field, she literally ripped me apart. So the lesson as a young player, because I was like, oh, sweet, she's so nice. And then I got on the field, I was like, so the lesson for us was like, okay, they're going to be my friend always off the field. But once you step on the field, it's about doing what you need to do to help this team win and to help the team have success. And for me, that was one of the big eye openers, because I was like so nervous and scared to be there, but also like, okay. And when I stepped on the field, I was like, oh my God, this is about business. This is what we have. This is what it takes. And I, for a second, was like, what am I doing here? Because I didn't know if I had it in me. But that matchup between us was unbelievable. And Karen, forever connected. I was in her wedding. I don't know if it has to do that she was my big sister, but she showed me the way and what not to do and what to do. And I think the youthfulness that we brought to the table was of, okay, you veteran players, you can't relax on your morals because these players are coming up. So there's a balance of it all. And it's really a hard situation to bring in 4 young players and get rid of 4 buddies and all that. But what Anson did for that, kind of to make it blend, was pretty incredible. And, what Jesse was talking about, just the chemistry and Coach Thompson picking those players that were right for the team, that he knew would help the team be great. And those are the same things that Anson did on our level.
So I think Christine steps us into what I think is probably the most important part of today's conversation for me, which is this organization, Positive Coaching Alliance, has a mission that all 4 of us believe really deeply in, that the youth sports experience should be more supportive and more positive and more constructive, because if it's the case, you'll build better people and better athletes. At times, people might confuse that with that every moment needs to be joyful and positive as the team interacts, as the coach interacts with the players, as the captain and players interact with another. Christine just talked about, an example there. Sam, I'll start with you and then go to Jesse. Sam, one of the things you and I have talked about, it's the part that I've struggled with the most as I think about the conclusions of your research and as I sort of see myself as a CEO, as a captain, is you learn some interesting things about the willingness of the best captains to push themselves to the line, and maybe some would say a little over the line. And one of my favorite chapters in the book is the Cuban women's volleyball team, which you might reflect on that and just this overall topic of positivity.
It was the biggest surprise and really one of the hardest things for me to figure out about these great captains. As I started researching them, I saw these incidents where they did things that were just, really not good. They would trip someone, legally in competition. Tom Brady with deflating the footballs. They would get in fights. They would push it to. There would be these moments where it seemed like they went too far. They went right up to the line. A lot of these, especially the Cuban women's volleyball team. Now, this is the craziest example. This is, by the way, the greatest Olympic team of all time. They didn't lose a match of any consequence in 10 years from a small country of 9 million. With a very small pool of players. And no great volleyball tradition. I mean, they were all undersized. I mean, they were not traditional volleyball size even. And they were the greatest team, in Olympic history. Now, they were, the dynasty was sort of falling apart, right? I mean, they were 6 years into it. They're at the Atlanta games. They had been forced to train in Japan. They're very tired. It looked like it was over. They lost a couple of games in the preliminaries and squeaked into the knockout round. And they had to play Brazil. Brazil was the second best team in the world and really on their heels. And the captain, Maria Luis, who was a incredible person, came up with this plan. She said, all right, this is the plan. We're going to get in their heads. We're going to yell insults at them across the net, right? And your teammates said, well, what do we mean by insults? And she said, the worst thing one woman can say to another, right? I mean, just let fly, right? And she calculated that the referee wouldn't, probably wouldn't throw anyone out because no one had ever done this before. So they start doing this and they're struggling, but then everyone kind of gets involved and the Brazilians start to get really mad and, and they start to beat themselves in a way, and they're overplaying and they wind up winning this match and going on to win and continue the streak. But now after that match in the locker room, somebody bumped somebody else and a huge brawl broke. It took a little 10 Atlanta cops to break this fight up. It was the biggest black eye for the sport. Maria Luis, the captain, was considered the ringleader of the whole thing. And I didn't understand this. I thought, what's going on here? Is cheating being part of being a great leader? But what I realized in talking to her and other people was that they believed that they didn't think the way most people think. They were so committed to the team's goals and the team achieving its outcome that they didn't care what anybody thought about them. They were willing to go, beyond the line of what people would approve of, as long as they got away with it. They would study the rules. They would study the referees. They would know exactly how far they could go. And they would go there when they needed to, not as a strategy, but only when it was super important. And the thing that was amazing was how embarrassed Maria Luis was about the whole situation. But also from all the reports and all the accounts and everyone I talked to, there was only one person trying to break up that fight, and it was Maria Luis. She was a leader who was willing to go to that edge, even if it made her look bad. And that's what all these leaders are willing to do. It's a very tough thing, especially in youth sports, to wrap your head around, because you don't want to tell people to do that. It can't be a strategy. It can't be every day. It's only when it's really important will they go to that line. And when they go to that line, the thing is, a lot of people will look at that person and say, well, they must lack character, right? They must not be leadership material. But the thing is, there's a difference. It's, why are they doing this? Are they doing it because they were personally hurt, or this is an ego thing, or are they doing it because they wanted to help the team achieve its goals? So you have to be very careful when you have a lead player who's a leader who goes right up to that edge and maybe steps over the line. You have to understand where they're coming from as a coach.
So we are certainly not endorsing hurling insults at our opponents here, but the part for me that I think is worth also reflecting on, Sam, is the accountability that the captain took afterwards. And again, she was reflecting on that got out of hand, and I think that accountability for things that don't go the way they're planned is a super important attribute of leadership. Now, Jesse, people that know Coach Thompson might not use the expression positive coach to describe his day-to-day coaching tactics. Yet, and you and I both know this, having spent tons of time at Georgetown, you will find hundreds of people who would say John Thompson was the most positive impact in my life. So as you think about and studied the Coach Thompson as a man and a leader, how do you juxtapose and process those two things? That at times his love was pretty tough love, but in the end, his positivity shone through.
Yes. So for those who don't know, Coach Thompson's favorite word was MFer. It was fully articulated. And he used that word towards a lot of his players. And he said, hey, I cursed a lot of these players out and I called them SOBs and everything in between. And then he said, but I always made sure that any kid that I dealt with like that, that they knew I loved them. And as coaches, I think that that's number one on the agenda of things that you have to do when you're beginning a relationship with a player or a team is to let them know that you really care, you know? And if you can do that, then you can get them to buy in. And it's hard to really care about, you know, a new crop every season, or, you know, or a kid who you might, you know, who might rub you the wrong way, or you think is arrogant or a brat or something like that. So Coach Thompson genuinely cared for all these kids. And then he could go to that place with them. Then he could cuss them out because the players knew that it was coming from a place of love. And but no, he was definitely, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows and lollipops with Coach Thompson at all, or probably not with any of the great leaders, you know, and the great coaches. And so it's a balance, and that goes back to emotional intelligence, where you have to know how far to go and when to ease up and when to push somebody beyond what they might think that they're capable of. That's really the art to it, and it's not easy.
Jesse, one more thing about Coach that's related is people use the expression a lot that Coach protected his players in big moments on big issues. So issues related to racism, issues related to inequity in education and testing systems, et cetera. How did you sort of experience his decisions about when to, quote, protect his players? It's like one of the things coaches today at the youth level think about is, you know, when should I be protecting my players versus letting things play out and letting them learn from it?
Yeah. So one of the biggest surprises for me with this book, and in the context of sports in general, it's a very male-dominated sphere, and stereotypically, quote unquote, masculine qualities there's a premium placed on them. Coach Thompson was primarily influenced by women. That was the foundation of his coaching style. His mother and teachers that he had who nurtured and protected him, and you know, would push him also. So all of that stuff about him protecting his players, he, you know, when he went and there's a famous moment in Coach Thompson's career for the youngsters among you. One of his players in a championship game against Michael Jordan and North Carolina made the ultimate bonehead play and literally handed the ball to the other team when Georgetown had a chance to make a shot and win the championship. And the first thing Coach Thompson did was hug him. And it made this tremendously important statement about who he was and what coaching should really be about. And he said, well, I thought about what my mother would have done. So he had all of these feminine, stereotypically, quote unquote, feminine characteristics that he absorbed into this big giant of a 6'10", dark-skinned, loud Black man. So, that protective aspect of it was something he considered his responsibility. And it comes again from trying to put his own desires and disappointments behind the needs of his players, Christine has talked about servant leadership. That's what being a servant is really about. You're there to serve these kids. It's a simple concept, but so many people don't do it that way. It was one of the most profound things that I learned about Coach Thompson and working with him.
Christine, I want to pivot, and it builds nicely off Jesse, to the topic that of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's something you care a lot about. Fortunately, in my view, DEI has become a mainstream important topic for all teams to grapple with, business teams, teams in government, and certainly athletic teams. As you reflect on maybe your own playing experience, but also what you're seeing now in society, how do coaches and teams and teammates best create an inclusive, equitable environment? How much of it happens organically versus it's intentional and directed by the coaches? How do you think about it?
Yeah, well, I think, in my book, the book is 13 chapters because of my number, but 13 chapters is probably one of the most important. And basically it says, do what's right. And I think when I look back to the time with our women's national team and what we were a part of and what we did, always the common theme about it was, well, what's right? What are we going to do? Is this what is right for the big picture? Not just this team now, but the bigger picture. I mean, the national team right now has got equal pay, fought for that and that. But in the beginning, we were fighting just to get paid. So there was elements that happened that, we could have done it for like, okay, we'll sign a contract for 5 years and we'll get this much money. But the team players coming up weren't going to get any more than that. So we were always like, okay, was this going to be for the bigger picture? And that's what I've loved so much about the team. And elements of inclusivity with everybody. Our biggest thing on our national team was, if you even hear Julie Foudy talk much about it, we all want to make sure that we knew that everyone mattered. And that goes from just the players on the field to our equipment managers, to, our medical staff, to our assistant coaches, to our families, to know that everyone had a role and it mattered on the team. And we went to such extents of our medical staff, which, they didn't get a lot of pay when they came on trips with us, but we would give them some of we would give them bonuses through collecting money throughout the players and did that. So those are ways that we try to show that, your role matters, you matter, no matter what you feel in this whole thing, you're contributing to our success. And so I think ultimately, if we struggled with people feeling like they didn't feel a part of the team, that we would try to find ways to make them know that they were. And I think that worked all right. I mean, sometimes maybe in the race issue, maybe some of the girls, we had a couple girls, Brianna Scurry and Saskia Weber, black girls on the team, that maybe we didn't necessarily understand some of the things that they felt at the time. And maybe I think in one aspect we could have maybe opened the door a little bit to have them more freedom of talking. I don't know. And hopefully they felt like they always were a part of us. But those are some instances I can think back in the time where maybe we didn't have openly discussions, where I think there's more discussions now, how people are feeling, what, those things, maybe that was offensive and we didn't realize it. So I think that's a better options that are happening. There's just more communication. And I think the more you communicate and more let people know that you care about them and love them, those are the things that help bring teams together and closer together. And that's the ultimate goal in our team. We just want everyone to know that they mattered.
Christine, I think your point's super important. I also would say, sort of my own research and my own experience, I tell our team all the time as it relates to DEI, it's not enough just to be a good person. Mm-hmm. We need to create space to talk about and confront and give free space for conversation about equity, about dimensions of race, about dimensions of socioeconomic background and cultural background that help people feel like they matter more. And I at least believe that the best leaders now, both on and off the field, are finding ways to create that intentionality of discussion, because the likelihood is that more people, to use your words, will feel like they matter in the fullness of time as they do that. Sam,
and can I say one more thing, Dan?
Yeah, of course.
In the same aspect, when I think about, young female girls and looking up and seeing female role models, that's the same aspect in anything of color, race that you are. The more people that you see out there that look like you, these young people feel like they can do something. So the examples that we have, whether there's an Asian background on the team, Black background, whatever, but more we have that and are being seen by the young people and other people out there, that changes the dynamic, that changes people's view on things. And I think that's really what helps as well, being seen. And I think that's really something that's real important.
Totally. Sam, you think a lot about assessments of both individual athletes and assessment of teams culture-wise. Mm-hmm. Like, are there things that you've seen teams do and coaches do well to either assess the non-on the field attributes of someone, or to what Jesse was referencing earlier, think about how these pieces and parts might fit together within the context of a winning team?
Yeah, that's pretty much all I do all day at this point. What I learned from writing the book, it's funny, I don't know if Jesse, you had this experience, but people like, you don't know what your book is really about until it comes out and people tell you what it's about. And what it was about, what I got back from people was, okay, great. How do we do this? How do we find these captains? How do we create a better leadership culture? So that's all I've been doing for the last 5 years. And I've been working with a bunch of teams. One of the first teams I've worked with is the LA Rams, and I'm still working with them. So obviously that's gone pretty well. But what
understatement alert.
Yeah, all right. I know I don't have my ring on, but it's, the thing about that I learned right away was that, I don't, you guys have probably experienced this in the US women's team, one of the great sports cultures in the world. I learned right away that leadership is a team sport. And the idea that one captain can do everything or should do everything is completely wrong. In fact, what I did was study teams and try to figure out what the different leadership roles on a team are. And there's 18 of them. I have 18 distinct roles that someone needs to do. Some of them are very small. Some of this is just being a confidant, being a sheriff, being the connector, being the communicator. There are all these different roles someone needs to play. It's impossible for anyone to do it all. You can't be a complete captain. So the theory that I brought to teams that I work with teams on is there's one thing. The first thing is the culture of your team. Every team has you want to sustain excellence, you have to have a culture that is repeatable, that is universal, that's broad, that has values that are broad enough to bring anyone in. I also think that's a great solution to diversity. If you have a strong culture with universal values that people from all walks of life can share, as opposed to tribal values, where only certain people have them. That's how you build it. You've got to have that culture. You've got to look for people who have the basic traits to fit into the culture of your team. But from there, you have to think of leadership and break it down into its component parts. And that's what we do. We do very intense assessments, because you were saying earlier, sometimes you throw people out because you don't think they have traditional leadership qualities. They don't have great personal qualities, but they may be really good at one thing. They may be a great communicator. They may be a great confidant. They may have one skill that they can bring to the team that they can do. So we try to identify what kind of leadership skills people have. And then you take those skills and you look at the entire unit, the entire team. And it sounds a lot like what Coach Thompson was doing intuitively, which is, I have 4 buckets. There's the contagion, the people who lift you up and calm you down emotionally. There's the execution, the people that are very focused on process and making sure you're doing things right. You have conflict, the people who uphold standards and they show fight and aggression. And then you have connection, the people who are the mama and papa bears, who take care of people, who connect people, and make sure people aren't being left behind. You need some balance of those 4 things in order to have your team work effectively, to be able to cover all the bases, so that whatever crisis you have someone on your team who has the leadership and the social skills to handle it, and it's going to get handled. So the role of the great captain is to do many of these things, but also to encourage and be grateful that other people are getting involved and participating in leadership, even to recruit them to do certain things that they're not good at or they can't get to. And that's really the model that we use. And yeah, I think we have to start thinking about people not as, are they leadership material or not?
Yeah.
But what kind of leader are they?
Yeah. And Sam, I'll get really practical for a second, because, I have 4 teenagers who are super competitive athletes. And I think about things like the forms that people fill out to evaluate children, right? And there's a 1 to 5 scale on free throw shooting, and there's a 1 to 5 scale on heading and defensive awareness, et cetera. And there might be a 1 to 5 scale on leadership. And I think one of the things that your research does and what you just shared, and as we all think about culture, well, maybe leadership isn't so binary and there's one type of leader. And maybe if we were more nuanced in the way we thought about leadership in the context of sports, we develop better team cultures, and we develop a better appreciation for the different types of leaders that are needed. And I think that's something that this positive coaching community can move the needle on.
Absolutely. No, one thing I will say to coaches about when you're choosing a captain. I mean, a lot of people will vote. I think that's a bad idea. I think giving it to the best player just because it's easier, is also not necessarily the right move. The thing that's really important, I really believe that as a coach, you should really try to find the person who you can have the best, most productive personal partnership with. But you're also looking for the person who has the most, we call them tentacles inside the team, because, it doesn't have to be the best player, even someone who seems like they have leadership qualities. They don't even have to be very vocal. It's the person who has the best relationships, with across the team, and who can take an idea and who can understand what the team's capable of and can sell it to them and can hold people together in tough times. So, my general theory is this. I'm telling you, if you're a coach, I swear this is true. If you want to measure the power of your culture, the strength of your culture, and really probably the strength of your team, just spend a day counting every selfless act that someone on that team does, not at all for themselves, not for their own advancement, but for the team. Whether it's picking up cones or whether it's, pulling someone aside and having a talk with them, it's showing up early and, helping someone. It's the little things you don't have to do. In the great cultures, you see hundreds of small little acts like that from everybody, not just the captain, not just the leadership, but everyone is doing these little selfless things. And if you could actually count them up and tabulate them, you'd have a pretty good sense of how strong your culture is. So look for the people who do those selfless things, who are doing that selfless work and who have the relationships, whether they're vocal or not.
All right, we've had some questions come in. We got about 10 minutes to go, so we'll try to go rapid fire through some of these questions. Christine, I'm going to start with you, and frankly, a pretty tough topic, especially given the recent passing of Katie Meyer at Stanford, which is pressure on athletes and pressure within teams. And what seems to be increasing pressure at even earlier ages to win, as Jesse suggested earlier. What have you seen? What suggestions might you have for helping create a culture that helps both coaches and teammates identify and deal with the negative impacts of pressure?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, when I look at just young kids these days, I think just the pressures in general, not just in sport that they have on them from school. I mean, I went through, high school and went to college. I was recruited, fortunately, but I was thinking of my resume going into college. I think I maybe did one community service. Not that I didn't want to do it, but I mean, like, it wasn't like, oh, you got to do this. You got to make your resume look good to get into college. You got to do this. You got to do this. You got to study this. You got to be on this club. And so I think there's so much that we want these kids to be already when they're not even being kids yet. And I think that's the element that's so missing right now, is just being kids. Like, you don't want them to worry about what you have to worry when you become an adult. Wait till that time comes. And even in sport right now, the fact of youth sports that's becoming so professional at the youth sports stage is just so hard for me to handle, because they're not. They're kids. They're kids trying to find their way. They're trying to be on the team. They're trying to help their team win. They're trying to win. I mean, I'm not gonna escape winning and losing, because you play a game. You play the game to win. But it's also the messages that coaches, and more importantly, parents, are sharing with their children, that to let them know that, okay, don't worry about your loss. And I think the biggest lessons for young people right now is to lose. Because if you learn how to lose now, when you get to life, when you don't get that job or something happens, you're in a better place to handle that. So I think two things: we're missing the element of the kids just being kids, and the messages that we're sharing to our youth on losses, on what you need to do, and more of let's enjoy being a kid and appreciate what they are doing. Give them some responsibility. You have to have some, if you're trying out for a team and you don't make it, you don't go trying out for another team, switch teams. You teach your kid, like, okay, you didn't make the team. what could you have done to next, what can you do next time to maybe make that team? I mean, my biggest love was baseball growing up. And I tried out for my all-star team, and my biggest lesson was up from the baseball field. I got cut. And I tried out next year and I made the team. So there's just those lessons, I think, more so from parents. And I'm a parent, and I tell you, I struggle with that more than anything, of seeing your kid cry, seeing your kid struggle, because you don't want them to, but that's the only way that they're going to grow and learn. So there's a lot of elements, but I think we do got to take it easy on these kids. And I don't mean easy and giving them less responsibility, but easy on the pressures of what they need to be before they're even there.
Love it. Sam, TJ asked, can you talk about observations related to Richard Hackman's research that you discussed in your book, specifically how team leaders must operate at the margins versus at the middle of the collective consensus?
Oh, that's great. Richard Hackman was this incredibly brilliant, gruff, chain smoking kind of guy who was a social psychologist at Harvard who, died about 10 years ago. And is really, I think, my absolute favorite. He wrote a bunch of books, and they're a little hard to penetrate if you're not an academic. But his whole theory, he embedded himself with teams. I mean, whether it was airplane cockpit crews, CIA intelligence teams, symphony orchestras, and he would watch the dynamics. And I think he knew more than anyone about team greatness. And the thing that he always said was, leaders. First of all, he said leaders were overrated, and that it was the same point I believe in, which is it takes a lot of people to lead a team, right? It's not just that person. It's not all on them. But at the same time, all that matters is that the leader makes two things. The leader makes sure that everything important that needs to get done inside that team is getting done, that someone's handling it. Now, they don't have to do it all or even most of it. They just have to make sure it's getting done. They have to be vigilant to make sure it's happening. But that was an interesting point. It's like, you can't be the person everyone looks to for everything. You can't be the voice necessarily of the team. You kind of have to operate outside the consensus, because one of your most important jobs is being a dissenter, is knowing when the team everyone's got a bad idea and they're going this bad idea, they're going in a bad direction. You know it. You have to be able to stand apart and stand alone and say, no, I'm not doing this, and really stand your ground. So you can never really be at the center of the consensus, right? It's not about being in the heart of the team with everyone around you. It's sometimes about pushing back. And I wish Hackman had was still around, because I would love to hear, I'd love to have a beer with him. But yeah, no, that research was really impactful on me.
So Jesse, there's a question people asking related to Coach Thompson, but you might reflect more broadly on it, which is, and someone's asking it more from a business context, which is, I have a really strong-willed manager or coach that is a dominant personality. What if they're doing things that don't reflect the culture that I think we need to have? How do I get through to them? How do I best influence the dominating personality?
I'm thinking about, there's probably my answer, and then there's Coach Thompson's answer.
Let's hear both. Let's hear both.
Coach Thompson once said to me, talking about being a player's coach, he better be a coach's player. So, I think that one of the values of sports is learning how to be coached and how to manage up and how to influence the person. In a college coaching environment, that coach has total control over pretty much your whole life, your playing time, your class schedule, your rooming assignments. All of that stuff often comes under their jurisdiction. So to the question, I think what Coach Thompson would say was, I'll listen to you. So make your case, but when you come to make your case, you better be prepared. You had better thought it all the way through. You had better not be acting out of something selfish. But if you have a genuine idea that you think will make the team better, then I'll listen to you. And then he would say, I'm going to make a decision, and then that's what the decision is going to be. So you can either get on board or you can get on out. So I think we have to be prepared for that. We have to be prepared for that. The Jesse Washington answer, yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to ask you about Coach. Did you think that because he listened to them and they knew that he had their point of view, do you think that made his decisions stick more? Or did they respect those decisions more?
I mean, I think it's case by case because Coach Thompson also said there's a lot of my players who can't stand me to this day, and I feel the same way about them. Well, he didn't say a lot. He said some. But no, yes, I do think that the answer to your question, Sam, is yes. And that when you know that somebody cares about you, then it's easier to get in line and to follow their lead. And Coach Thompson also was a tremendous communicator. I think that sometimes he would have chosen to explain why I'm doing this way. And you may not like it, but this is my bigger picture because you MFers have to learn A, B, C, and D. And I mean, from my perspective, I've had tough coaches and tough bosses, and you got to be ready to sort of, make your case and then live with the consequences.
I agree with that. The only thing I would add, and this is in a case-by-case decision, as both of you have said, but there are times that there is strength in numbers. And there might be times that having a couple colleagues with you to have that conversation is really helpful because the conviction comes from more. You also can go overboard with that and bring it to be a 20-on-1 conversation and then a little less productive. So let's close here with a rapid fire round robin for each of you. I'm going to ask Christine from the sort of context of a player, Sam from a coach, and Jesse from a parent. PCA's mission is very clear. What's the one piece of advice or one wish, Christine, you would have that would help us develop more positive players?
Oh, more positive players. I think if what I try to do when I teach and I teach kids, and I think about how I was as a player, how can you make your teammates look good? So if players step out on the field and they're going to play, it's not like, oh, my dad wants to see how many goals I can score. It's like, what can I do when I step on the field to make my teammates look good? Because if you're going to make your teammates look good, that means you're going to clean up some messes and the team's going to be better. So I think a message where when you step out on that field, it's not about necessarily of what you need to do for your own to feel good, but what you need to do to make your teammates feel good.
Love it. Sam, how about from the perspective of the coach?
There are three things. I mean, the first one I would say is be intentional about culture. You cannot spend enough, most coaches don't invest enough time in thinking about the culture of their team, the leadership dynamics. You need to spend more time on that. The other thing would be, sorry, I had this in my head. Be intentional about culture, be demanding, but not demeaning. Always, and make sure that you God, I forgot the third thing.
Well, people read your book, Captain Class, and I'm sure it's in there.
It's in my head somewhere.
Jesse, I'll give you the final word, which you can talk about parents or talk about anything you want.
Yeah, for coach to develop more positive players, I think that we always have to remember that the purpose of sports is to help people become better people, particularly on the youth level. The purpose is not to win. The purpose is not for us to look at as coaches or as parents, And so if we always keep in mind, how can I help this young person develop? How can I help uplift their character? How can I make them a stronger and better person? Sometimes that might be being tough on them. Sometimes it might be being more understanding. But if that is the paramount purpose, John Thompson was an educator and a teacher above all. And so if we can apply that to people's character, then I think we'd all be better off as a result.
All right, 3 books to go by. Powerhouse by Christine Lilly, Captain Class by Sam Walker, and As I Came as a Shadow by Jesse Washington. I'm Dan Helfrich. I've written no books, but it was incredibly fun to have Christine, Sam, and Jesse. Let's all do our part to keep the Positive Coaching Alliance mission at the forefront because there's a lot of work to do.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.